It started as just another glamorous night on The Tonight Show, until Margot Robbie heard something that made her stop mid-sentence and changed everything forever. Studio 6B was buzzing with that electric energy that came with A-list appearances. Tonight, Margot Robbie was back on The Tonight Show to discuss her latest film and the unexpected journey from Australian soap opera actress to Hollywood's most sought-after leading lady. We have this saying, "Don't get too big for your boots," and it's something that was drilled into me from a young age. But honestly, the thing that keeps me most connected to home is the accent, the way we speak. There's something about hearing an Australian voice that just immediately takes me back to my childhood. As Margot spoke about her homeland, her own accent became slightly more pronounced, as it always did when she talked about Australia. Her eyes naturally scanned the audience, a habit she'd developed from years of performing and genuine curiosity about the people listening to her stories. That's when she heard it, a small voice, barely audible above the studio's ambient sound, but distinct Australian. "Nana, she sounds just like Mummy used to." Margot's storytelling rhythm faltered slightly. Something about that little voice, the way it carried the exact intonation she remembered from her own childhood. The careful pronunciation that only came from a child trying to hold on to something precious made her stop mid-sentence. "Actually, Jimmy," Margot said, her voice taking on a different quality, more focused, more personal. "I think I just heard something that's reminding me why accents matter so much." Jimmy looked curious, but patient. He'd learned to trust these moments, when guests followed their instincts. Margot stood up and walked toward the edge of the stage, her eyes scanning the audience until she found the source. "I could have sworn I just heard a little Australian voice in the audience," she said, her own accent becoming more pronounced. "Am I imagining things?" In row 4, Ruby looked around frantically, then slowly raised her tiny hand. The audience turned to look at her, and she felt her cheeks flush with a mixture of excitement and embarrassment. "There you are," Margot said, her face lighting up with genuine delight. "Hello there, sweetheart. What's your name?" Ruby stood up slowly, clutching her Barbie tighter. When she spoke, her voice was small but carried clearly through the studio's sound system. "I'm Ruby Chen," she said, and even though her accent was fading, there was still that unmistakable Australian lilt that made Margot's heart skip. "Ruby! That's a beautiful name," Margot said, her voice warm with recognition. "And you're Australian, aren't you? I can hear it in your voice." Ruby nodded shyly, then looked at her grandmother. "I used to be more Australian," she said quietly, "but I'm forgetting how to sound like Mummy." The studio fell completely silent. Even the Roots stopped their gentle background music. Jimmy felt something shift in his chest. This wasn't an interview anymore. This was about to become something much more profound. Margot felt tears forming in her eyes. She understood immediately what was happening. This little girl was losing her connection to her heritage, to her mother's memory, and it was breaking her heart in real time. "Ruby," Margot said softly, "would you mind if I came up there and talked with you for a minute? I have a feeling your mummy was pretty special." Jimmy immediately understood what was happening. "Margot, go," he said without hesitation. "We'll wait." Margot Robbie, one of the biggest movie stars in the world, left the stage and walked into the audience. The cameras followed her, but everyone in the studio somehow understood that this wasn't about creating good television. This was about something more sacred. Margot reached Ruby's row, and the people around them shifted to make space. She knelt down in the aisle so she could be at Ruby's eye level, and for a moment, two Australians, one famous, one unknown, connected across generations and circumstances. "Tell me about your mummy," Margot said simply. Ruby's composure broke completely. "She was from Australia, like you," she said, through her tears. "She taught me to talk like her, but Daddy says I sound American now. I don't want to forget how she sounded." Margaret, Ruby's grandmother, reached over and gently touched Margot's shoulder. Sarah, Ruby's mother, passed away 2 years ago, she explained, her own Australian accent thick with emotion. Ruby's been living with her father here in New York, and she's slowly losing her Australian accent. She's so worried about forgetting her mother's voice. Margot looked at the grandmother, then back at Ruby, understanding the full weight of what was happening. Ruby, can I tell you something about accents? They're not just about how we sound. They're about carrying our families with us, carrying our stories forward. Behind the scenes, Jimmy made a decision that would define this moment forever. He walked down from the stage and joined Margot and Ruby in the audience, abandoning every protocol of television production. Ruby, Jimmy said gently, kneeling beside Margot, what would your mummy say if she could hear you right now? Ruby looked at the Barbie in her hands, then back at Margot and Jimmy. She'd probably tell me I'm being silly, she said, with a small laugh through her tears. She always said it didn't matter how I sounded, as long as I remembered where I came from. Margot reached out and gently touched the Barbie that Ruby was holding. Is this special? She asked. It was Mummy's when she was little in Australia, Ruby whispered. She brought it with her when she moved to America. Daddy gave it to me so I'd remember her. Margot felt something break open in her chest. She understood exactly what this little doll represented. The bridge between two worlds, the tangible connection to a homeland left behind for love and dreams. Ruby, Margot said, I want to tell you something important. Your accent isn't disappearing. It's just changing, growing, becoming part of who you're meant to be. Your mummy's voice isn't in your accent. It's in your heart. The studio was completely quiet now, everyone hanging on every word. But I'm scared I'll forget how she sounded, Ruby said, tears streaming down her face. Margot looked at Jimmy, then made a decision that would change everything. Ruby, what if I taught you something? What if I showed you that being Australian isn't about sounding a certain way? It's about carrying certain values, certain love, certain strength. She turned to address the entire studio. Everyone, I want to tell you about something beautiful that's happening right here. Ruby is learning one of the most important lessons about heritage. It's not about perfecting an accent or sounding a certain way. It's about carrying love forward. Margot turned back to Ruby. Your mummy didn't love you because of how you sounded. She loved you because of who you are. And every day you choose to be kind, brave, and loving. You're speaking with her voice. But Margot wasn't finished. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small silver bracelet, something she always wore during interviews as a reminder of home. Ruby, this bracelet has a little Australian flag charm on it. I've worn it to every important event since I moved to America. I want you to have it. Ruby's eyes went wide with amazement. Really? Really? Margot said, carefully placing the bracelet on Ruby's tiny wrist next to the Barbie. And every time you look at it, I want you to remember that being Australian isn't about how you sound, it's about how you love. It's about being loyal to your family, being brave when things are scary, and never forgetting that home is wherever your heart feels safe. The audience erupted in applause, but it wasn't entertainment applause. It was recognition applause, acknowledgement of something sacred that had happened in front of everyone. But there was one more surprise. Margot stood up and addressed the audience again. Ruby, I want everyone here to understand something. You're not losing your mother's voice. You're learning to use your own voice to carry her love forward. She looked directly into the main camera. How many of you have worried about losing connection to where you came from? How many of you have felt caught between two worlds, two cultures, two ways of being? The studio was completely silent, but it was the kind of silence that comes when universal truth is being spoken. Heritage isn't about perfection, Margot continued. It's about love. It's about carrying the best parts of where we came from into where we're going. Ruby isn't losing her Australian identity. She's creating a new one that honors both her mother's homeland and her own journey. Jimmy returned to the stage, but he didn't try to transition back to normal show business. Instead, he did something unprecedented. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Tonight we learned something important from Ruby Chen and her grandmother Margaret. We learned that heritage isn't about holding on to the past perfectly. It's about carrying love forward in new ways." Margot added her own message, still standing with Ruby. "And we learned that the most important accent any of us can have is the accent of kindness, of love, of remembering that we're all carrying someone's hopes and dreams forward." Ruby Chen returned home to Brooklyn that night, but she left the studio with something she hadn't had in months. The understanding that she didn't need to sound like her mother to honor her mother's memory. She just needed to love the way her mother had taught her to love. Margot kept her promise in ways that went beyond the bracelet. She arranged for Ruby and Margaret to have a special video call every week, and she often joined them, helping Ruby feel connected to her Australian heritage while celebrating her American present. The Barbie that had traveled from Australia decades earlier became even more precious. It wasn't just a toy anymore. It was proof that love transcends borders, that families can span continents, and that sometimes the most important journeys are the ones that help us understand we never really lose the people who shaped us. 6 months later, Ruby started a pen pal program at her school, connecting American children with Australian children, helping others understand that different accents and cultures make the world more beautiful, not more complicated. Margaret made 2 more trips to New York before she passed away peacefully the following spring, but she died knowing that Ruby understood her heritage wasn't something to lose or preserve perfectly. It was something to carry forward with pride and love. The Tonight Show episode featuring Ruby's story became one of the most watched segments in the show's history. Immigration support groups across the country reported increased enrollment from families trying to help children navigate cultural identity. Language preservation programs started emphasizing emotional connection over perfect pronunciation. But perhaps the most important change was in Ruby herself. She learned that she didn't need to choose between being Australian and being American. She could be both, carrying her mother's love and her grandmother's wisdom into her own unique story. Margot still wears a matching bracelet to every interview, and she often tells audiences that the most beautiful thing about success isn't the movies or the fame, it's the moments when you can help someone understand that they're exactly who they're supposed to be. The worn Barbie sits on Ruby's nightstand now, next to the Australian flag bracelet, both reminders that love doesn't have borders, and sometimes the most important thing you can do is help someone understand they're becoming who they're meant to be. And Jimmy Fallon learned something that changed how he approached every show. Sometimes, the most important conversations happen not with the celebrity guests, but with the children in the audience who are learning that being caught between 2 worlds doesn't make you half of anything. It makes you twice as rich in love. It wasn't just late-night television that night. It was a masterclass in cultural identity, a reminder that heritage is about love, not perfection, and proof that sometimes the most beautiful accents are the ones that carry multiple stories, multiple homes, and multiple ways of belonging. Some voices carry more than one homeland, and that's not a loss, that's a gift. The iconic New York City skyline glittered through the studio's massive windows, creating the perfect backdrop for what everyone expected would be another charming conversation filled with Margot's infectious laughter and Jimmy's enthusiastic curiosity about her meteoric rise to fame. The audience was filled with admirers of Margot's versatility. Jimmy had been looking forward to this interview for weeks. Conversations with Margot always had warmth, touching on staying grounded, despite fame and chasing dreams across continents. What nobody noticed during the pre-show excitement was the small figure in row 4, seat 8. Ruby Chen, 8 years old, sat perfectly still in her pink sparkly dress, clutching a worn Barbie doll that had clearly been loved through countless adventures. Beside her sat her grandmother, Margaret Chen, 68, who had traveled from Sydney to New York for what doctors said would likely be her final visit to see her granddaughter. Ruby had been living with her American father in Brooklyn since her Australian mother's death 2 years earlier. Due to complex visa issues and custody arrangements, she hadn't seen her grandmother in over 18 months. Margaret had used her life savings to make this trip, knowing that Ruby was slowly losing her Australian accent and, with it, the last connection to her mother's homeland. The worn Barbie in Ruby's hands had belonged to her mother, Sarah, who carried it from Australia to America. 25 years earlier, Ruby's father insisted they attend because seeing Margot Robbie might help Ruby feel proud of her heritage, instead of embarrassed by her fading accent. "Daddy," Ruby had asked quietly during the pre-show wait, "do I still sound like Mummy did?" Her accent was barely detectable now, just the faintest hint of Australian vowels that seemed to disappear a little more each day. The show opened with Jimmy's usual warmth. When he introduced her, the applause was sustained, 200 people showing appreciation for someone who had become synonymous with both success and authenticity. Margot walked onto the stage in an elegant, emerald dress that caught the studio lights perfectly. She hugged Jimmy warmly, waved to the audience with that characteristic blend of Hollywood glamour and down-to-earth charm, and settled into the guest chair with the relaxed confidence of someone who had learned to be comfortable with fame while never losing sight of where she came from. "Margot Robbie, everybody," Jimmy said, settling behind his wooden desk. "Thank you so much for being here. I have to start by saying, every time you're on the show, I'm struck by how you've managed to stay so grounded despite this incredible journey from Australia to Hollywood. What keeps you connected to home?" Margot smiled that genuine smile that had endeared her to millions. "You know, Jimmy, I think when you grow up in Australia, there's something about the culture that keeps you humble.